around the gates of the city, and in some specific areas which provide the connection between the historic area and the new development, in order to control the traffic, in particular to avoid, further demolition and to open new vehicular access, to the historic city, and in order as well to provide some minimum services like parking, bus stop, and so on, in connection with the entrances to the historic city. The first step was to, as I said before, to provide temporary measures of protection. We will talk about that a little bit later, but also to start with the GIS. To start with the inventory and the GIS. Now I show you the process and the outcomes, and then we can discuss about on the survey sheet, which shows the way the survey was structured, the kind of data that we were looking for, and how we were looking for this data. So the first thing to do is to prepare the conditions for the inventory and to establish the GIS. So in other terms, to prepare, first of all, to plan and to design the survey, which is quite a complicated task, particularly in a city as large and as dense as Sana. So, of course, we decided we realized, we soon realized that there were two types of fabric, urban fabric, which were completely different. On the one hand, the residential fabric, and on the other hand, the souk area, which have totally different typological characteristics, and which requires a kind of information which were totally different. Then we had another problem, that the cartography that was available was beautiful to pin up on the wall, but it was absolutely unrealistic. So it was a very, very impressionist. I mean, it was not a cadastral map. It was a map that was finally drafted by the Korean, when they did their infrastructural work. It was painted in watercolor, but the shape of the building was absolutely, a fantasy very often. The problem was that in many cases it was impossible to identify the houses and the properties. So we decided to not to record the properties, but the building, so the built structures. A house can be composed by several buildings. A house of a family may be composed by several buildings, but we didn't know. We were unable to, since we didn't have a cadastral map, we were not able to know what the house was. We were only able to identify the individual buildings. So this was the first decision, that our survey, the record of our survey would concern each record a building. Be small, large, high, low, a building, a structure. So the first problem was to have a map. We tried to update the map, but we soon realized that the work of updating was extremely complicated, and that it was better to update the map during the survey. So the survey was not only aimed at collecting the data concerning the building, but was also aimed at updating the map and producing a map that could be used as a base map for our GIS. As you know, I'm not a specialist, and I put it very simple. A GIS is made of two main elements, the base map and the database. The base map has to identify all the objects that are recorded in the database. And there should be a direct and very straight relationship between the map and the database. So if an object is not well identified on the map, it cannot be recorded, and vice versa. You cannot have two records for the same object. And the other point is that in both cases, in the map and database, all the objects which form a record, which are the object of a record, have to be clearly identified with a series of letters, numbers, names, or whatever. So that's why we have subdivided the city in different areas, which are areas for the survey, which are not necessarily areas which have, let's say, an intrinsic identity. You know, these are areas for the survey. Within each area, we have identified sub-areas, and so on and so on and so on. Okay. So we studied a survey form, trying to understand which were the data that were needed in order to identify the value of the building, to define if a building deserves protection or not, and what kind of protection. But also to identify the building so that a control of the building activity would have been possible later. So the kind of data that we decided to collect for each building during the survey was discussed very much with the Yemeni officials, and as we will say, and as we will see later, led us to a too heavy and very complicated survey sheet. But I mean, this is a mistake that it is regular, normally done the first time that you start. So this was the first survey that it was made in Yemen, and the Yemeni officials wanted to have a lot of details that were totally useless. But I mean, in any case, this was the only documentation they were supposed to have, and so let's do it. On the other hand, the data that we wanted to collect were the data that were referring to the kind of characteristics that could be controlled by the building regulation. Let me be clear on this point. Very often, like in this case, surveys collect a lot of data which are totally useless, to fix the regulations. There's no possibility to control. There's no interest. For instance, I don't know. You can, in a survey, you can ask for, who lived in that building, who is the owner of this building, and so on. This is a data that, from the planning point of view, is without interest. Is without interest to have the name of the inhabitants. It can be even counterproductive. What is important is to know if that building is privately owned, is used and occupied by an household or by an activity or by a public administration or whatever. You don't need the name. You are not planning the inhabitants of the buildings. You are planning and you are regulating the functions of the buildings.
Here, remember that we keep the records.
Huh?
We keep the records of the builders and the owners because it belongs to a specific. When Orlando has built here,
But then when you do the plan, what you say that this building has to be inhabited by a family that comes from, I don't know, a certain city, or has to be inhabited by a tall man with blue eyes, or by a blonde woman.
Irrelevant, but if was a specific...
No, so, I mean...
If the building had a purpose, was built with a purpose,
so,
and was like a guild, you know.
No,
like
what I want to say is that here we were looking for an inventory which was aimed at setting up a regulation. Also to document the current situation, but it was not aimed at being
from the architectural point of view.
Yes, a documentation
but
of
as heritage value.
We had very little money. We had a very limited span of time, and so we know perfectly that there are a lot of researches that can be made, you know, on a city. Historic researches, archival researches. We didn't have time and we didn't have resources to do that. This will be done later, if possible, by someone else. Yeah. And indeed, the database we designed was open to future and next edition. But when you are looking for an inventory which has to serve immediately or in a short period, you know, to establish a regulation, you need first of all to collect the data which are necessary to set up your regulation and which are important and therefore normally are the data which may concern the elements that you can control. Well, you can control the building height of a building, of course. You walk in the street and you can see. You can control to a certain extent the functions of the building.
Right,
okay?
But
you can control to a certain extent the facade of the building. But you cannot control, I don't know, the color of the hair of the lady who lives there, you know, for instance. So you cannot control the inner distribution of the rooms, for instance. No? You see what I mean?
Yes.
Also, think of the Yemeni administration, which is not particularly efficient and solid and heavy. There were 3 architects to control all the historic cities of Yemen. So you cannot ask these 3 architects to be able to control, you know. So in the end, we had a survey form of 17 pages. To me, are too much, but really too much. 2 pages would have been enough. But anyway. They were pleased to do that, and we helped them to do that. We will see later. So
it's not supposed to include all the history of the...
not all the history. Yeah. You will see what kind of information there are, which are very interesting, I must say, which are very interesting. The inventory has lasted 2 years instead of 6 months. I mean, taking into consideration the Yemeni measure of time, the same inventory could have been done, let's say, in 3 months. However, there were, in the end, 15,000 records, so it's not very small. So, but in any case, what was important was to train the surveyors. In Yemeni, as I said before, this was the first inventory that was made, and many terms and many operations, even the simplest one, were totally unknown in Yemen. So we produced a sort of handbook for the surveyors, and we made a period of trial with the surveyors on the ground in order to test the survey form, to revise it, and to produce a handbook, a final handbook accordingly. This handbook shows how, for instance, what is the system of defining the identity number of the buildings. You can have a compound. Presumably this is a compound for one family, or this is a parcel. Presumably, we are not sure at all. And we decided that, and we show with this drawing, that they had to identify all the buildings one by one and to give each building an ID number, because we were not sure at all that this was one property. This may be different properties, and in any case, even if there was one property, the number of built structure, the built structure were so different that produced an urban impact which was the same of different properties, not of one unique property. We decided that we also the open areas in between the buildings have to have their ID numbers, because, and then in the end they had a specific sheet, survey sheet, and also some specific buildings, like for instance wells or fountains or well, of course the mosque, the schools and so on, but even some construction, some structures which are not really buildings, but which belongs in any case to the historic fabric, were identified and surveyed with a specific sheet. Most of all, we realized that differently from other cases I showed in Bologna, for instance, or whatever, or even in Venice, you know, there was the identification of the typology. In this case, the typology was not important, was not interesting in me, because the typology was always the same. The tower house developed in height. But what was important was the fact that every building, every facade has a specific characteristic. So we decided, instead of trying to identify the building typologies, we decided to inventory the different facades. The facade which opened on the public streets or on the open spaces, like the Bustans, the Melchemart, and so on. As a consequence, an ID number was given to all the structures, and then ID number was given to all the facade, to all the relevant facade opening to the public spaces, or you see in this case, opening to the Melchemart, to the opening to the garden, So in every building you could have three types of, in every parcel, let's say, you could have three types of open spaces, of ID number. The ID number for the building, the ID number for the open spaces, and the ID number for the facade. Normally in an inventory, one of the crucial issues is to define the value, architectural value of a building. This evaluation is directly linked, of course, to the kind of protection you want to ensure to the building. Here, of course, there is, you will see in the survey form, an evaluation, a total evaluation of the building. But we realized that in reality it was much more interesting to have an identification for all the building of the elements which used to belong to the local tradition, and of the elements which were inconsistent with the local tradition, or which were inconsistent with the so-called legislation on historic cities that was acting at the time. So, together with our Yemeni colleagues and together with the surveyors, which were coming from different regions and which had a different terminology, We have identified on a number of examples, on a large number of examples, all the elements that appear in the facades of the buildings. With the names that, you know, each of kind of window as a special name, and as a special function, and so on. So we set up